Hi, I'm Paul Battaglia, and this is section 2.5, Zeros of Polynomial Functions. I'm joined today by Gabe and Brittany. And Brittany, I asked you first, where do you find yourself concentrating on in section 2.5? What's the material that you find yourself focusing on with students?
I focus on the rational zero test first, but I find that my students aren't very motivated and they kind of get bogged down in all of the calculations. So I wanted to ask you, how do you keep your students motivated?
You know, it's a tedious test for them, especially if you have larger coefficients to deal with, So what I usually tell them is the one good thing we have going for us is that we're finding rational zeros. So at the end of the day, the numbers we're using are going to yield nice numbers for us. They're all going to be plus or minus to test out. And what we're looking to do is to hopefully find that clue that we can just get one. All we need is one to get us started. I think sometimes they see a list of 4 or 5 zeros, and they start to think, do I have to test all of these? And of course, the truth is maybe, but in reality, usually I think we find ourselves getting lucky with one of the early zeros, So that is something that I would do to try and keep them motivated. But look, along with that come misconceptions. I mean, and common errors. And this happens all the time because the test is so tedious and they lose their concentration and their focus. So Gabe, what are some things that you see?
So since this is such a long process for students to go through, I like to point out a couple misconceptions before I even turn the students loose to practice on their own.
Okay.
So something that I have them look for is to make sure their polynomials are in standard form to begin with. So this helps them actually see what their leading coefficient is as well as what their constant term is. And then I really like to reinforce the idea that their values for p have to be the divisors of the constant term, and the values q have to divide the leading coefficient. So those are two things that I really want to reinforce right from the get-go.
Yeah, that's a good idea because then it really sets them on the right track, and then I think they feel at least a little bit more comfortable. And then, like Brittany, you said, maybe they're not as jumpy about going forward.
Yeah. Yep, exactly.
So the next thing we'd like to probably focus on then in this section is forming a polynomial. And when we do this, it's nice to remind them of how the factor theorem plays into the process, and also the idea that complex roots occur in conjugate pairs. In fact, one of the statements I'll actually put in as a warm-up or as an assessment is the idea that I might say to students, a polynomial of degree 4 has zeros 1, 5, and 2i. What's contradictory about this statement? I'm hoping that they understand that because of the conjugate pairs, that there needs to be a negative 2i there as well.
Yeah.
So that helps a little bit. But there are some errors that students will still make when forming the polynomial, right?
So something else that's important to point out is that these polynomials don't always have to have a leading coefficient of 1.
Right.
So I think in the book it says there's an a times an x minus c1 times x minus c2, and so on. So that a term is actually really important, and you can easily work around that by doing a couple examples where students actually have to solve for a.
Solving for a.
So you give them the zeros
to
and maybe an extra point that the graph passes through,
Right.
and that helps them.
Yeah, it's a great idea. And I think if we do that now, I think you're hitting at the core concepts in this section. And I think it gives them an idea of how everything plays together. We've been talking about behavior of functions. We've been talking about zeros and all these concepts tied together. And here we are now being able to give them this situation where we also now tie in the idea that you might have a leading coefficient other than 1, which is helpful.
Yeah.
So I hope that you found these tips helpful and that you find much success in section 2.5.